Will this week be remembered as a turning point in Israel's war in Gaza? World leaders condemn its killing of 7 international aid workers in what Tel Aviv calls a grave misidentification error. The US once offered unwavering support for its strategic ally. Now it's conditional.
What we want to see are some real changes on the Israeli side. If we don't see changes from their side, there'll have to be changes from our side.
It's been a good week for democracy in Senegal. A fair election after months of protests led to a peaceful transfer of power as an opposition straight out of prison is sworn in.
Mr. Bassirou Diomaye Diakhar Faye was elected President of the Republic of Senegal.
And this week, President Macron gave his backing for the most listened to French artist in the world, Aya Nakamura, to perform at the Olympic ceremony. It comes in the midst of a culture war, with opposition politicians claiming she's vulgar and doesn't represent the French language.
I think she has a perfect place in the opening and closing ceremonies of the Games.
I'm Gavin Lee. This is The World This Week. And with me from the World's Press Corps is Richard Worley, seasoned European correspondent for the Swiss newspaper. Good evening. I want to start with you, formerly in Tokyo, Geneva, Brussels. The list could go on. But tell us about your new book. Let's have a quick look at it. This is The Ball of Illusions, published in the last few days.
Well, it's about how the world views France. You know, France has a tendency to believe it is still a world power. It can still have an influence and a say on world affairs. So we went around with my co-author François d'Alençon. We went in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and we asked diplomats, politicians, observers, what do you think about France? What do you think about French power? And the subtitle says it's what France believes, but what is the world seeing?
Well, some of those perceptions might come in very useful tonight. Richard, thank you. Vivian Waltz, correspondent for Time and Fortune. Let's flash up your latest piece within the last 48 hours. This is about power of one of the most profitable company in the past 10 years, Saudi Aramco. A deep insight. And what springs out to me in this long read is the CEO of the Saudi Arabian state oil company. You say this, he delivers a speech to an audience in the US, talking about the green transition. And I quote, he says, the world has been trying to transition in fog without a compass on a road to nowhere. Great quote, but he would say that, wouldn't he?
Yes, he would. And, you know, this was sort of like a jolt to the world. But the Saudis have heard this from their government for a long time. And in fact, the last time I was in Saudi Arabia, the energy minister had said pretty much the same thing to me, that people are living in a kind of fantasy land about climate change. Yes, we're sitting here in Paris, we're going to go buy our electric vehicles, but people in Africa and India and so on can, barely afford their electric bills if they even have electricity. So there's a real kind of disconnect between these grand promises that the EU is making, for example, and the reality for millions of people around the world.
It's a long read, but if you've got time this weekend, I think it is a well-worthy read. Vivian, thank you. Could this week be remembered as a turning point in Israel's war in Gaza? 2 separate airstrikes carried out within hours of each other on Monday may have profound ramifications for different reasons. Firstly, Israel admitted it killed 7 international aid workers in Gaza, quote, stemming from serious misidentification failures. It's led to widespread condemnation. Western countries say initial Israeli answers, it was a tragic accident, wasn't sufficient. And recent unwavering support from the US, now wavering and conditional on steps Israel now takes in protecting civilians.
We obviously will watch closely and monitor how they do on the commitments that they make. And as I said earlier, if there's no changes to their policy and their approaches, then there's going to have to be changes to ours.
Our brave men will punish the Zionist regime. This regime can't escape the consequences of the devilries it commits. It's accessible. It's vulnerable. They know what will happen. They know.
So that second clip was the most senior general in Iran. The other strike that happened late on Monday evening, around 5 o'clock, an Iranian diplomatic compound in Syria hit a building said to be off limits, essentially sovereign territory. It killed 2 Iranian generals, 5 support staff, and may have escalated the long shadow war. Israel's military being warned to prepare for, quote, any scenario. Troops having leave cancelled on Thursday, GPS blocked across much of the country. And we just heard, speaking at the funeral of those commanders today in Tehran, the message of retaliation from the military commander-in-chief. Richard, 2 significant moments. Let's start with what comes next from Iran. What's your reading of this?
Well, for sure, Tehran is going to try to strike at Israel. So we can expect a strike, what form or another, probably coming from the Hezbollah, which is the Lebanese ally of Iran. Now, will it work? Will it be, first of all, will they manage to strike Israel before being shot down? Because that's always what Israel is doing, and Israel has an air defense, a very valid air defense. Or the second option, it's terrible to say that, but we could expect a terrorist attack, somewhat, because Iran knows how to do that, suicide squad. So I would not be surprised if something big is being tried in the coming days. But again, don't forget, Israel is in a state of war. It's hyper protected. So the chances for Iran and its proxies to reach Israel in the manner that they would like is quite slim.
Vivian, when you look at what's going on, do you see an escalation as a benefit to either side here?
No, and I think that, Iran has clearly for the last few months not wanted to get involved. They didn't see much benefit for themselves. Their work was effectively being done, but without them actually being directly involved. Now they are. And in fact, if you think back 6 months to right after October 7th, you had President Biden coming out and warning Iran not to get involved. That was actually the very first thing he said. And in fact, what he didn't say was a warning to Israel. And the things that he should have said early in the war are now kind of coming back to haunt him.
And it is worth just pointing out, Richard, in all your travels, I think it's fair to say over the years, it is pretty rare, if not unprecedented. I think I have to go back to the late 90s and the Chinese embassy being struck by the Americans for another example of a sanctity, essentially, in war, a compound diplomatically.
True.
That's why this raises the stakes.
Yes, and the case of the Iranian embassy in Damascus is quite different from the Chinese consulate, if I remember correctly, in Belgrade. Because, well, Syria is close to Israel, you know the situation in Syria, you know the links between Iran and Syria. So it is an act of war that has been waged by Israel on Iran. It's Iran territory officially, but to me that does not matter very much. What matters is that those generals were meeting in a diplomatic compound in Damascus. So clearly Israel had information about it. Let's put it this way. There were apparently some commanders from the Islamic Jihad, probably people from Gaza. I do not know the details. But by doing that, Israel knows that there is a clear risk of retaliation. So they are bearing this risk, and they probably weighed their option and thought it was better to kill those generals while they could do it.
I think that brings us nicely into this other airstrike. This is hours later. So we're talking from 5 o'clock in the evening on Monday, the Iranian strike in Syria. Then we go to this international convoy hit. Vivian, what do you make of the answers, the reasoning we've had from Israel so far, and the geopolitical ramifications of its accidental strike on these aid workers?
Well, what's so remarkable is we've had, I believe we're up to 33,000 dead, according to the Palestinians. And yet this is the first time that the US has come out and effectively said, we're going to somehow put conditions on our military aid. They haven't actually said what those conditions are. It's still very mushy language, but nonetheless, it was enough to get Israel to release what was their internal investigation. They fired the 2 military officers who were effectively in charge of having hit the convoy. And it still is not enough, of course. They are still saying that there were grave mistakes made. It looks to the rest of the world that this was a targeted attack. We've had 200 aid workers killed in 6 months. It's unprecedented in any war. I don't think there's ever been such a death toll among humanitarian staff. And so it raises as many questions as it answers.
Do you think this week will look upon it as a turning point?
Yes, I think so. I think so. I mean, I think that, you know, it's one thing to have all these aid workers killed who were working for, you know, organizations that Westerners are not perhaps very familiar with. This is a famous, beloved organization and run by a famous, beloved chef. And I think it has been a real wake-up call for people. And the people that count, people in Congress, people in the White House, who have for months been pushing Biden to move. And Biden has been deeply reluctant. And I think he simply can't avoid it now. He cannot avoid actually putting pressure on the Israelis and effectively trying to get Bibi Netanyahu out of power.
Richard, briefly, do you agree? Could this be look back as a turning point?
First of all, I have difficulty to understand what is the concept of misidentification, which is what Israeli government is saying. When you look at the way Israel is waging war in Gaza. Gaza is overflown permanently by drones with video cameras, drones who are detecting whatever happens in a vicinity of few centimeters. And they are saying now that it was a misidentification, while we know that the World Central Kitchen car had the sign on top of the roof. And we know also that apparently after a first strike, 2 persons went out from the first car to join another car. So frankly speaking, I do not buy this version. So now the question is, why did they strike this car? Is it because they thought wrongly that could be the misidentification?
Well, in a briefing to journalists last night, the IDF said that they thought they'd spotted a gun. The drone later looked, it was a bag. Okay. And that's part of the grave mistake they're going to look at.
Then you can't avoid the second option, that they decided to strike because they wanted this operation to stop. This operation of bringing humanitarian aid to Gaza and to the Palestinian people right before starting the last step of the war. And so far, Netanyahu has not said anything about it. He still planned to go for the battle in Rafah, in the south of Gaza Strip. So the big change, I don't completely agree on that point. The big turning point would be if Netanyahu says, I'm not going to engage the battle for Rafah. I'm ending the war here, but at the moment, it's still the plan. So we can expect more from the present Israel war cabinet.
And don't forget also that, you know, they have tried in a very modest way to get aid in and have been blocked by Israeli protesters. There is a number of Israelis who simply will not want any aid to go into Gaza. And they might well have been the drone operators when the attack happened.
Well, let's go 5,500 kilometres southwest of Gaza. Let's go to Senegal, where the new president was sworn in on Tuesday. It doesn't sound like the swearing in of a new president. It sounds far more violent than that. Believe me, it was peaceful and a surprise for many observers. Fair election after months of protest. Here's the moment.
Mr. Bassirou Diomaye Diakhar Faye was elected President of the Republic of Senegal.
So, in the prelude to this, protests against the government of Macky Sall, the jailing of key opposition leaders, and, well, we have this man, Diomaye Faye, the new president, Bassirou Diomaye Faye, barely a week out of prison. He won the election outright in the first round, surprised even seasoned Senegal analysis and predictions of a likely rigged, unfair election. Now, if we look at what's been going on, clean transfer of power this week, but for Western governments, his lack of leadership experience, zero, could be an issue. He is a proxy leader for the more charismatic Ousmane Sonko, who couldn't run because of a criminal conviction, which he says is politically trumped up. Sonko's base want radical change, distribution of wealth, contracts for oil and gas to be reviewed, we're told. These are questions around Senegal's post-colonial relationship with France, too.
The exploitation of natural resources, which according to the constitution belong to the people, will receive particular attention from my government.
Richard, how significant a moment is this for you?
Very, very significant, because there is a lot of hope behind the election of the new president. And that's, for me, the most important, the hope of the youth of this African nation who wanted a change. And we did not figure out that it will end up peacefully. Few weeks back, we were all worried about a possible bloodbath because Macky Sall was not ready to concede power. There was fighting in the streets with the police and so on. Finally, it came to a positive end. This president is indeed not experienced. His prime minister is more popular, so there is always a risk that the two at some point will confront each other. But I see hope. The new generation in Senegal, they wanted a change. It's been democratic, and so far he's been cautious. Look at, for example, a very precise point, the French military base in Senegal, in Dakar, 300 and something soldiers. He did not mention it so far. So if he remains cautious, and if European countries and Western countries in general are intelligent and smart enough to play with him the good way, to give him the chance, we could see something positive and promising.
And there's a European international ripple effect here, Viviane. You've spent a bit of time with President Macron. You'll get a sense of the Elysee. How do you think the French president is working out what comes next in terms of French ties with Senegal?
Well, it's clear that in all of French-speaking West Africa, France has been really losing the kind of the battle of public opinion, deeply unpopular. It's troops being essentially ordered out of countries. And
Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso.
Exactly. And it simply is sort of facing a situation where it doesn't have the influence anymore. And in fact, until recently, the new leaders of Senegal were going to create a new currency that wasn't pegged to the euro. They rolled back on that. Obviously, they realized it would be...
In that first speech, we got a sense of that,
it would be an economic disaster. But nonetheless, I agree with Richard. This is a very, very young continent, not just country.
With oil, with energy.
With huge national resources. We're not just talking oil and gas, but critical minerals right across that region. And you've had these fossilized leaders sitting in a lot of these African capitals, and people have had enough. So I think it's not only a kind of ray of hope in Senegal, but I think it could be a kind of signal to other countries.
Well, we've got the youngest, you talk about fossilised, the youngest ever Senegalese leader, 44. Little is known of him. He's got no leadership experience. His running mate, the new Prime Minister Ousmane Sonko, has a former mayor. You mentioned the power dynamic. Viviane, do you think we're going to see a potential overtaking where Sonko is effectively the puppet master here?
Probably. But, that's not such a bad thing. I mean, there are plenty of countries where you have essentially figurehead presidents. And he does appear to have come off as a kind of moderate leader. And, the thing about the Western leaders complaining that he doesn't have leadership experience, I think to a lot of Senegalese, that's kind of a benefit. That's a strong point, not a weakness. Leadership has been miserable in a lot of that region. So I think if we have Sonko, it'll be interesting. Yes, he's a charismatic kind of firebrand type. But he might be what this country needs at this moment in time.
But you both say a rare moment of pause wherefore, perhaps some jaded international correspondents can lift a smile for once. OK, something good happening. Well, from there to another sense of French influence, Aya Nakamura, most listened to French artist in the world, more than 1 billion downloads on Spotify, twice that in YouTube views. This is her, 28, born Aya Dainoko in Mali, grew up in the suburbs of Paris. Nakamura, her stage name.
t'atteins, dja dja, genre en katana, baby, tu gâtes ça. Tu penses à moi, je pense à faire de l'argent. Je suis pas ta daronne, je te fais pas la morale. Tu parles sur moi.
Well, right now, she's at the heart of a culture war, triggered by reports that President Macron sounded her out to headline the Paris Olympic opening ceremony 16 weeks today. On Thursday, at the inauguration of the Aquatic Centre, this is what President Macron told reporters.
She's an artist who is the most streamed of all French-speaking artists. She speaks to many of our compatriots. And I think she has a perfect place in the opening and closing ceremonies of the Games. She is also part of the French culture, French music. You mentioned Aya Nakamura. Edith Piaf too.
The French far-right opposition outraged some of the Conservatives too. Marine Le Pen, leader of the opposition National Rally, recently spoken about Nakamura being, quote, not a beautiful symbol for France.
I'm not even going to tell you about their entourage. I'm going to talk to you about her outfit, her vulgarity, the fact that she doesn't sing in French. She doesn't sing in a foreign language either. She sings we don't know what.
It seems many French people agree with her. In a recent poll, 73% said Nakamura does not represent French music. 63% oppose the idea of her headlining at the opening ceremony. So, should Aya Nakamura headline the Paris Olympics? Richard, how do you assess this row?
Well, if you ask me, the answer is yes. It doesn't mean that she has to be the only one singing. You could imagine one or two or three singers during this opening of the Olympic Games. But she deserves the spot. She's very successful. She's very well known. And you were asking about my book at the very beginning of this show. Well, the book is about France's influence in the world. At the moment, Aya Nakamura is an asset for France. She's a new French in a way because she became French, I believe, 5 years ago or something. She's from Mali, which can be seen as a problem because we know the difficult relation between Mali and France at the moment. But after all, it's also a way promoting her is also a way to overcome this type of problem and to show not only the African but to the Malians that France is forward-looking. So to me, yes, she could be easily singing Piaf with a beautiful voice. She's not going to sing Jaja at the opening ceremony. She will sing eventually Edith Piaf. And once again, if you want to have an influence in this world, you have to look at the world as it is, not as you would like it to be.
Vivienne, I'm not going to ask you to do an a cappella version of Jaja. I'm going to ask.
I wish I could.
I'm going to ask where you see this, because there's clearly some racist elements on the far right. What Marine Le Pen is saying, though, is this is not about racism. She claims it's about vulgarity too. Parents of children want to go to the Olympics and see this.
Let's be honest. If she was an immigrant from Sweden, we wouldn't be having this conversation in all likelihood. Plus, I believe she actually moved to France as a baby. Mm-hmm. I mean, she's effectively French, even though she only got her nationality, a few years ago. But
from the suburbs around Saint-Denis, where the Olympics will be put on.
Yes, exactly. The whole message of this Olympics has been multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic. This is the new France. And to deny that is really, at this point, a fundamental part of 21st century France it's just simply stupid.
What do you make of the fact that the polls, briefly, Richard, we haven't got much time, but a lot of French people saying that they disagree. She shouldn't headline.
I'm not surprised because, first of all, a lot of French people probably don't know her. And they can't be blamed for that. I mean, they have the right not to know Aya Nakamura.
About a generational issue then.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if there would be a bit of pedagogy, and I think that's what's lacking at the moment, but the reason is that Macron was not taking responsibility for that until now. For the first time, he has said that eventually she could sing. But before, the information went out in media, but he was not confirming it. So if there would a bit of pedagogy to explain who she is, what she will sing, because to me, what matters is not who she is, but what she will sing and how she will sing it. And if she sing Edith Piaf, L'Hymne à l'amour, for example. And once again, she doesn't have to be the only one. I just be reminded that when it came to the 200 years of the French Revolution is 1989, the Marseillaise was sung at the Champs-Élysées by Jesse Norman, the American, I understand, black opera singer.
So this is about moving on.
It is about seeing the world as it is and seeing the French influence in the world as it should be, open and looking forward.
A nice ending. We have to leave it there, so we're pile on time. Richard Worley, Vivian Wald, thank you both for joining us. We'll be back for The World next week. See you then.